Hello, this is Dr. Scott Jensen, and today we're going to take 20 to 30 minutes to have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation about the condition of Minnesota. This might arguably be compared to a State of the State address. It's no secret that I'm running for governor. I'm running to be the next governor in Minnesota. And at 6 o'clock today, Governor Tim Walz will give his State of the State address. The bully pulpit capability of the governor's office should not be underestimated. So you're going to hear a variety of things from Governor Walz at 6 o'clock tonight. I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to provide a rebuttal to much of what he says before he says it. You wonder, well, why are you doing that and how can you do that? Well, he's given some indications of some things he's going to say, and I think I have a pretty good idea of what he's going to say. And I think you have a pretty good idea of what he's going to say. We're going to see some spinning, some message spinning. We're going to hear how remarkably well Governor Walz and his team have led. So in advance of that, I want to share a different perspective. I want to share a perspective from not just conservative Minnesotans, but Minnesotans across the state that I've had a chance to meet over the last 14 months. Literally tens of thousands of Minnesotans. And they don't necessarily sit on one side of the aisle or not. Not at all. Because I'm going to be pretty focused on what I'm sharing with you, I'm not going to be able to respond to some of the questions that might show up during this Facebook Live. But I'll certainly have a team looking at things and we'll try to get back to you. So I want to make sure that I give Governor Walz the chance to revise some of his anticipated comments tonight, because I think some of the things that I share are absolutely from the hearts and minds of Minnesotans. And Governor Walz might want to address them tonight, even if he wasn't intending to. In order to participate and watch this with me, I want you to know that wherever you are, whether you're in a pub or in your home or in your car, I don't want you to think that you have to mask. And I don't want you to show yourself or anyone else a photo ID. And I don't want you to feel like you have to demonstrate a vaccine passport. These are the things that if you want to go to the state Democratic convention, you have to do. You have to show a photo ID. You have to show a vaccine passport. And then I think you have to get tested. And if the test is negative, then wearing masks is elective. But mind you, the Democrats have been very clear, as has Governor Walz and Secretary of State Steve Simon. There should be no reason for anybody to show a photo ID when they vote. Only when they go to the Democratic State Convention. So here we go. Why me? Why would I be the person that should respond to Governor Walz's State of the State? Well, yesterday when we were out campaigning, this was a letter that we received from multiple places. And this is a letter from Tim Walz to many of his supporters. And evidently, Tim Walz and his team has selected me to be the spokesperson for the other side of the story. Here's what he says. He said, Scott Jensen, the emerging GOP frontrunner, has picked a lieutenant governor running mate, former NFL football player Matt Burke. It's easy to see why Jensen picked Burke. Burke supports a ban on abortions in Minnesota. No kidding, Sherlock. You're darn right we do. And we're going to. And we're going to get something done when we're governor. We're going to ban abortions. That's really not news. Then he goes on in this letter, says, Jensen won the recent Republican straw poll by a landslide. Oh, then he sticks in, can we count on you to protect Minnesota from a Jensen-Burke takeover with a donation of yada, yada, yada. Then he goes on and says, Scott Jensen currently has all the momentum in the GOP primary. Scott Jensen has all the momentum right now. So evidently it's Governor Walz, who has selected me to do the rebuttal to his State of the State address. So let's start out with public safety. In a recent edition of the American Experiment, we have an article from Ron Ebensteiner, and he says this: do we sit idly by as our cities fall like dominoes to lawlessness and fear? Or do we start holding our politicians and public safety officials accountable and enact laws that can put us back on track toward a state of peace and prosperity? Mr. Ebensteiner says, I vote for the latter. I'm with you, Ron. Then he goes on to say, right now, we do not feel safer, and it's a consequence of dismal, even cowardly leadership. He says, when we can stop at a red light and not be fearful of being a carjacking victim is when we are on a path to recovery. Our police and law enforcement officers need to be emboldened to confront criminals and violent goons and keep them off the streets. That's a good introduction to public safety. I would say this: we need to focus on public safety like never before. We need to absolutely understand that we need more cops on the streets. But regardless of how many we put on the streets, we will not be able to put the genie of lawlessness back into the bottle easily. This is going to take many efforts on the parts of many and on the parts of all individuals. We need to respect the work that police do, absolutely. And we need to realize that incarceration has to be a tool by which to serve as a deterrent so people don't keep doing these things. This is not the time for a sentencing commission to make things easier. This is not the time to mistake a catch and release program, which might work okay for walleyes and fishing, but doesn't work okay for repeat felons. This is a Minnesota issue, not just a Minneapolis issue. And honestly, I don't think we get public safety back until we elevate our Second Amendment rights and allow ourselves to truly keep and bear arms, which means that we need to pass promptly stand your ground legislation, constitutional carry, and we need to have Castle Doctrine written into our statutes so that you can do whatever you need to do to protect yourself in your home or your business, in your car or a motel room, wherever. These are not rights given to us by men. These are God-given rights, identified in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what we need to do. So, if you remember the words of the preamble to the Constitution, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare. These are the things we have to do. And public safety relies on our government doing those things, and they're not. What does Matt Rosenberg have to say in a recent volume of Imprimis? He says this. He's a journalist and an author, and he's a Chicago guy. And he says, easy probation has become a license to kill. Why won't judges properly assess risk, even in juvenile cases? The answer is all too clear. Criminal justice has morphed into what advocates on the bench and in prosecutor offices describe as social justice. But where is the justice for the victims and their families? The rush to empty out jails and prisons is costing lives. And even more than just costing lives, it's invaded our land with a spirit of lawlessness. He goes on to say this: the left today has badly misappropriated the word equity, using it to mean equality of outcome, something to be achieved through affirmative action and economic redistribution. But real equity, in the old sense, cannot be given. Real equity requires the old-fashioned virtues. It is inextricable from full ownership of your own course in life. That's what Mr. Rosenberg has to say. Let's move on to education. I've been a strong advocate for school choice. Governor Walz hasn't. Governor Walz is going to speak tonight about the need to throw more money at education, despite the fact that in the last session, in the budget session, K through 12 education received one of the largest increases in dollars in more than a decade. Doesn't it feel to you like this is a bit of a black hole, that we just keep dumping more and more money into the system without getting a return? I mean, our achievement gaps are increasing. The minority populations, they're the ones who are saying this. We are now underperforming several cohort groups in Mississippi. And Mississippi spends approximately $9,000 per student, and we spend 150% of that at $13,500. Well, there was a recent infamous journal, The Continuing Importance of Thomas Sowell. Well, Thomas Sowell is a black economist. He's 91 years old. I think he's written some 25, 30 books. He's a brilliant mind. And this is what he says about schools. Schools exist for the education of children. Schools do not exist to provide ironclad jobs for teachers, billions of dollars in union dues for teacher unions, monopolies for educational bureaucracies, a guaranteed market for graduates of teacher colleges, or a captive audience for indoctrinators. That's what Thomas Sowell has to say. And I think he's right. He goes on to say this, or actually the writer of the article says this: Sowell would often be asked how it felt to go against the grain of so many other blacks. He would inevitably correct the premise of the question. You don't mean I go against the grain of most blacks. He would respond, you mean I go against the grain of most black intellectuals, most black elites. But black intellectuals don't represent most blacks any more than white intellectuals represent most whites. See, what Thomas Sowell wants to do is he wants to have a real conversation. He wants to lead from a position of courage, not cowardice. He's willing to go where maybe he's not supposed to go. But it's in the questions that we receive clarification. And it's in the clarification that we gain a deeper understanding of the issue we're addressing. And it's in the deeper understanding that we become better citizens and better leaders. So, what is it that George Will had to say in the last few days about Joe Biden's pandering to teachers' unions, pandering that directly harms school children? Here's what he had to say. George Will: charter schools are tuition-free public schools authorized to exercise wider discretion in educational practices than most public schools that are tightly enveloped in union rules. Although charters do not divert public funds from public education, teachers' unions generally oppose them because charters expand parents' choices, thereby infusing into public education something teachers' unions dread: competition. That's what George Will had to say about it. I think you're going to hear Governor Walz speak to the need to follow the teachers' unions. I take care of lots of teachers in the office, and they're not enamored with the teachers' unions' political positions. Teachers do not want to be characterized or judged based on what you think of teachers' unions, and I don't want to be judged as a family doctor based on what you think of the American Medical Association. Teachers don't go into teaching for six-figure salaries. They go into teaching to touch kids' lives, and we should respect that. I was on the school board for 10 years. I was chairperson for 3 years. My running mate, Matt Burke, and his wife started a school. We know a bit about education, and we know that throwing more money into a black hole doesn't solve the problem. As long as we're talking about kids and education, let's talk about women's sports. This is an article in the recent Thinking Minnesota, spring of 2022, written by Jenna Stocker. And she, by the way, was a member of the University of Minnesota swimming team at one time. And this is what she had to say about kids and sports and girls and boys. Quote, allowing biologic men to compete as women against women destroys the fundamental concept of what makes athletic competition, specifically women's sports, fair. She went on to say, all of these qualities that she refers to that come from sports, being a graceful winner, a graceful loser, the value of hard work, working through adversity, team cohesion, all of these qualities helped build my character and eventually led me to be commissioned as an officer of the United States Marine Corps. Thank you, Jenna, for your service. She went on to say this, but if I knew the sport I loved was rigged against me in the form of obsequiousness to wokeism masquerading as fairness, I might never have participated. Let's unpack that sentence. Rigged against me in the form of obsequiousness to wokeism. Obsequiousness is when you sort of brown nose. You sort of are oftentimes referred to as kissing a lower part of someone's anatomy in order to pander to them. Wokeism, I don't think we need to identify. But this is what she said, and I think she's right. She said this further in the article. Will Thomas lived and competed his whole life as a male, only identifying as a female and joining Penn's women's team as Leah this year. Folks, you can experience a gender change if you choose. That's a mental and emotional and personal issue. But that doesn't change that every chromosome that you have in your system is still XY. It doesn't change the fact that your muscle fibers are longer, thicker, with quicker action potentials. These things don't simply change or alter because you said out loud that you're uncomfortable in the phenotypic appearance that you carry with you every day. It doesn't matter. That's a separate thing. We're creating a whole host of problems by letting your emotional, personal issue literally turn our society upside down. I won't allow that. We're hypersexualizing our kids. Literally, we have some curricula being proposed whereby 5 and 6-year-olds are taught that some boys have penises and some girls have vulvas. Really. It's also interesting to note that the number of people who create, produce, and disseminate child pornography, less than 10% of them ever spend 1 day in jail. And the pattern has been established and is quite clear, particularly in Minnesota, because we know that there's a pipeline of human trafficking from Minnesota to New York. But the pattern from child pornography to human trafficking, to sex trafficking, to ultimate slavery to prostitution, it's not argued by anybody. It's real. I can't imagine the horrific misery that it brings about. You can certainly understand why so many of these folks, these victims would be, frankly, they probably prefer to be numbed by opiate addiction so they can't really know the hell they're living in, and why suicide becomes such a very reasonable consideration for them. Let's move on. So we've talked about public safety. We've talked about schools, and I advocate for school choice. Let's talk about secure elections. I'm astonished that in Minnesota, if you talk about this, you're some sort of nut job. You're called names, you're a conspiracy theorist. In 2000, Democrats all over the nation were pretty upset about the hanging chads in Florida. And the ultimate decision in December of 2000 that decided that George W. Bush would be president. 46 out of 47 countries in Europe use some form of photo ID. I believe some of the polls have indicated that 70 to 75% of Americans believe that some sort of voter ID should be utilized. Last year, in 2021, the Star Tribune printed an article that had originally come off the Associated Press wires. And it mentioned a gentleman named Haldeman, I think it was J. Alex Haldeman. He's made a career studying electronic voting security. His research has changed the concept of stolen elections from theory to reality. This is what he firmly stated when he looked at a group of U.S. senators and he said, quote, "I know America's voting machines are vulnerable." He's a University of Michigan computer science professor, and he testified as such in June of 2017, before the 2020 election. He went on to say this: "We've created attacks that can spread from machine to machine like a computer virus and silently change election outcomes. And in every single case, we found ways for attaching to machines and to steal votes. These capabilities are certainly within reach for America's enemies." Now, this was not an article in the Star Tribune, but it was Mr. Haldeman that was quoted in the Star Tribune article from 2021, where he spoke of how easily a viral malware could be inserted into a computer. So I don't think that we need to belittle people who have concerns about the fairness and the trustworthiness of our elections. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with Minnesotans where they have told me that they had 2, 3, or 4 ballots mailed to them. I have had a chance to review the data that came from the forensic audit in Maricopa County in Arizona. And I saw the PowerPoint presentation, and it indicated that there were something like 282 dead people that had voted. But more concerning was the fact that there were more mail-in ballots returned than went out. Honestly, I think we can all accept the fact that there are shenanigans. It's challenging to know what threshold did this get to. But between harvesting and vouching and abuse of the absentee ballot system, and, if you will, the disconnect in the mail-in balloting, we've got problems. Every American should want this fixed. This is not something to quibble about. But tonight, I think you might hear Governor Walz chastise people who think that Steve Simon has done anything other than a terrific job. Well, I was in the Senate in 2020, and I saw the end-arounds that were put in place by Secretary of State Steve Simon, with Attorney General Keith Ellison's support and Governor Tim Walz's support. The legislature is to be the one, the body, the branch that decides how our elections take place. But COVID and emergency powers were utilized to do an end around. Folks, I think it's time to talk about how broken our government is, because I don't think Tim Walz is going to talk about that tonight. There was an article in the paper today. Jennifer Brooks wrote it, and she said this: as the legislature hurtles toward the end of session, tucked into a massive House omnibus bill is language that would sunset the current state flag and seal and set to work on a redesign. Do you see the brokenness? Why would this bill be tucked into an omnibus bill along with dozens or hundreds of others? We need to stop the omnibus bills as much as we can. They are supposed to be topically related. We are going to see this session omnibus bills that may well intertwine education and energy and healthcare. And that's actually against the Constitution. They are supposed to be germane one to another. Governor Walz will be just fine with these constitutional laws being violated. He's done it before. He'll do it again. And honestly, if I could use the bully pulpit of this address I'm giving, the condition of Minnesota, I will tell you this. Governor Walz has not yet completed an end of session without having to corral all the power and put it in his lap. That's what's happened. The name calling. So here's another article in the paper today, because I don't think name calling really becomes a governor. But this was an article about one of my opponents for the Republican endorsement, a friend of mine, Dr. Neil Shah, who's a very bright man. Anyway, this is what Tim Walz's campaign manager, Nicole Johnson, said. She dismissed Neil Shah's candidacy, along with the bids of some other GOP hopefuls. Quote, Shah is running on a platform as unhinged as Scott Jensen. Well, I didn't know I was unhinged because it looks like Governor Walz is the one who basically appointed me to be the person who would best respond to his State of the State address. But Dr. Neil Shah is anything but unhinged. He's a bright guy, finished very high in his medical school class, a family man, thoughtful, smart, started his own clinic, started businesses. So Tim Walz's campaign manager is calling him unhinged. Then she goes on and says, and refers to Shah's campaign as irrelevant as Michelle Benson's. Okay, so Nicole Johnson says that Michelle Benson's campaign is irrelevant. Sorry, Michelle Benson and I worked together for 4 years. She's a smart lady. She works hard. She has done budgets with Health and Human Services, arguably the largest budgeting that goes on. To call Michelle Benson irrelevant is an insult to her, but even more, it's an insult to every legislator. It's quite frankly an insult to every person in Minnesota. But Tim Walz evidently allows this name calling. Fraud. Here's something about fraud. On January 21st, 2022, some 200 law enforcement agents descended on a little-known nonprofit as the FBI executed 3 search warrants of their offices and related entities. Thus began the saga of the Feeding Our Future scandal. This was an article written in Thinking Minnesota Spring 2022 edition. It went on to say this: no background checks were conducted by either the nonprofit or the government before the millions of tax dollars were doled out is a minor scandal in itself. Goes on to say this: since 2017, the 2 lead nonprofits received $445 million from the 2 federal programs. This is waste, fraud, and abuse. It needs to be researched. And then we have this article. Man connected to Feeding Our Future probe arrested trying to leave the country. A Minnesota man who has emerged as a target in the Feeding Our Future scandal was recently arrested while trying to leave the U.S. for Kenya. On Wednesday afternoon, 4 days ago, FBI agents arrested Mohammed Ismail, 49, at the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport and charged him with 1 count of passport fraud. Ismail is believed to be the first arrested individual with alleged ties to the Feeding Our Future scandal. Let's talk about energy. This is what the Wall Street journalist Elisa Finley said about the EQT Corporation CEO, Toby Rice. He was defending fossil fuels. He said this: if you're blocking pipelines, you're blocking the biggest green initiative on the planet. What is he really saying here? What he's really saying is that we need to have a thoughtful conversation about energy. That if we really want reliable energy and a complete grid, a reliable grid, we're not going to be able to depend on solar and wind alone. And if we do want to reduce our fossil fuel dependence, I would say that nuclear energy has to be a part of this solution. But I don't think Tim Walz is going to lead tonight on a conversation regarding energy, because that would be fraught with political risk. But I'll tell you, in our campaign, Scott Jensen and Matt Burke, you will hear us talk about that. So now we come to the economic state of affairs in Minnesota. This is a big one. I wish that we as Republican candidates on the trail would talk a bit more about the economic impact of what's gone on over the last 26 months. Again, this was an article in Thinking Minnesota from spring of 2022, written by John Phelan, a bright, thoughtful individual who has quite the British accent. He says this: and a recent Thinking Minnesota poll found that while 45% of Minnesotans think our state is on the right track, 48% believe it is on the wrong track. This is important. 48% think it's on the wrong track, more than the people who think it's on the right track. In 2019, only 38% thought we were on the wrong track. And in 2018, only 26%. So now we're up to 48%. Now we have more people in Minnesota thinking we're on the wrong track, an unsustainable track, than who think we're on the right track. Then he talks about taxes. And he says taxes are too high. I agree with them. But listen to this. Regarding the top rates in terms of state taxes, in the District of Columbia, New Jersey, and California, all of their top rate taxation rates go into effect at $1 million annually or more. In New York, the top rate goes into effect at $25 million per year. But in Minnesota, you will go to the top taxation rate if you make $166,000. In Minnesota, our lowest tax rate is higher than the top rate in half the states. Minnesota is one of only 12 states that has an estate tax. And of those 12 or 13 states, I guess Washington, D.C. may or something. Yeah, they do too. But anyway, it says that only one of the 13, and only 13 of the 50 have an estate tax, but only one has a higher rate than ours, and that's Vermont at 13%. We also have an alternative minimum tax on corporations. If you look at this graph of inflation-adjusted dollars in terms of spending from the general fund in Minnesota on each Minnesotan, per capita general fund spending, and you go back to my birth year, 1954, literally it's gone up from around $500 to $4,500. It's gone up almost 10 times. Government is spending 10 times more per head than they were previously on inflation-adjusted dollars. So this is a real change. That's astonishing. There's no question we should not be taxing Social Security dollars. They've already been taxed. But that's not where the conversation should stop. The conversation should include a robust conversation. What would Minnesota look like if we didn't have a personal income tax? What would it look like if we joined the other 20% of the states that don't have a personal income tax? How did some of those other states go from having a personal income tax to not? We're smaller than Wisconsin in terms of population, but yet we collect 150% of what Wisconsin collects on personal income tax. We collect 133% of what Wisconsin collects on sales tax. We're taxing Minnesotans right out of the state. That's what we're doing. And it's having an impact. In the spring of 22 edition of Thinking Minnesota, John Hinderaker says this: our economists identified 12 metropolitan statistical areas that in the year 2000 had gross domestic products closest to that of the Twin Cities. What he's saying is we wanted to go out and find some comparables. We wanted to find some places that seemed reasonable to compare ourselves to. And so they had a peer group. They created one of 12 others in our own. That's 13 metro areas. How have the Twin Cities fared in comparison with those peer areas in the following years, in the 20 years since they did that? In a word, poorly. Out of those 13 metropolitan areas, we finished 11th in terms of economic growth. We have become a magnet for people who want to avail themselves of our entitlement programs. Mr. John Hinderaker says this: Minnesota gains residents from other states on net, but only in the income category from $0 to $25,000 annually. We break even in the range from $25,000 to $50,000. And we lose residents on net in every income category over $50,000. Sometimes Minnesotans will agonize over whether we are losing the rich to states like Florida. I would tell you this: we're losing the company starters, the job creators, the producers. We can try to make ourselves feel better by kidding ourselves, deceiving ourselves. But we have become a magnet for those who would avail themselves of our entitlement programs. And we are losing those who don't sleep well at night because they're constantly thinking of, how can I do this better? What company could I do? How could I extend the scope of what my company does? Could we do something upstream that we haven't been doing? Could we do something downstream that we haven't been doing? When I'm governor, I want to propose an economic plan. And these are some components that it'll include. We are going to, right from the get-go, use the bully pulpit of the governor's office to become a pro-business state. We're going to create a culture that appreciates small businesses, people that start companies that have ideas. And we're going to reduce regulations because regulations and permits and licensures and applications are killing Minnesotans. And you know what we're going to do? We are going to absolutely extend our economy. I was at a company recently in Ely. They sharpen knives. They've made a go of it, but they didn't stop there. They started to extend the reach of their business. They decided not to just sharpen knives. They decided to start creating robotic machines they could sell to companies so that companies could sharpen their own knives. They extended their reach downstream. They extended their reach upstream. This is what we need to do. And we've got a huge problem with supply chains, and I don't think we have seen the worst of it yet. I would just say two things about supply chains specifically. I think we all know it's a problem. First off, you're going to see more and more problems in the world of medicines because so many of the ingredients that go into our medicines that people take orally, intravenously, intramuscularly, so many of those ingredients come from other countries, frequently China. So you can imagine things aren't going to get better until we start to put these supply chains upstream and downstream and do them in America. We should do them in Minnesota. You know what we could do? We could actually use the natural resources that Minnesota's been blessed with. We could mine copper and nickel. We could do it in a responsible way as we've done mining for hundreds of years. And we could contribute to the solution of our supply chains because that leads me to the second point I want to make. Joe Biden, President Biden has said that he wants by 2030, half of all cars sold to be electric cars. Well, right now, the supply chain necessary to create and continue the supply of batteries to take care of that level of electric car in 2030, the supply chain that would be necessary, 90% of it doesn't exist at this point. Literally, we're creating our own strangling bottleneck around our economy. We are not going to have the ability to have a domestically produced supply chain of batteries necessary to do or to supply what President Biden wants. So that means we're going to have to, you got it, look elsewhere. You got it, China. Seriously, folks, if in order to make ourselves feel good about some sort of green movement, we increase our dependence on China, does that make any sense? Are we crippling our own strength? You do better negotiating when it's two equals rather than this. I think we have to start thinking about our planet, not in just this one factor of climate change. I think we need to talk about the ecosystem. And arguably, we all live in the same ecosystem. So somehow we have got to work with China to make sure China is doing all that it can do because it's got 5 times the number of people we have. We need China to be as motivated as we are to go green. And they aren't. And if we increase our reliance on China, don't you see? We're crippling our negotiating capability. We're making things worse. This is crazy. So what else would I want to do? Well, I'd want to remind people that whatever you incentivize, you're going to get more of. What do I mean by that? Well, if you tell people, listen, we'll pay you $600 every week, so you don't have to go to work because we don't want you spreading this COVID-19 thing, you're going to get more people staying at home. And you're not going to be able to flip a switch and all of a sudden things go back to normal. Whatever you incentivize, you're going to get more of. We need to develop a workforce that fits our needs, but also fits the needs of the worker. We need to think about, in the same way we have this PSEO, this post-secondary enrollment option, we need to have a PSTO, a post-secondary technical option. We need to be getting kids out of their junior and senior years in high school and getting them into the hospital to draw blood and to maybe do pulmonary function tests and EKGs. We need to get them in cabinet shops, helping to learn how to work with tools and build cabinets and auto mechanics. And there's all kinds of trades. I mean, HVACs, electrical, plumbing. Quite frankly, we've absolutely brainwashed our society into thinking that when you're 18, the ideal next move is to go to college. Hogwash. I think we all know better than that by now, hopefully. We need to talk about energy, and I've said it before, I mentioned it, but nuclear has got to be a part of our solution. If we're not thinking that way, we're just burying our heads in the sand. We need to talk about a new square deal, and you know who's really fired up about that? It's the young people. When I talk to people between 15 and 40, they want to talk about things that we haven't talked about so much. They want to talk about, what does consumer protection look like when we're getting vaccines mandated and we have to do something against our core convictions that we really hadn't wanted to do? What if we get harmed? What if we get myocarditis? The pharmaceutical company isn't taking responsibility. They have no liability. So what does consumer protection look like for those folks? What does corporate responsibility look like when Pfizer or other big pharma companies don't have to accept responsibility for their product? And Pfizer in 2021 will make $35 billion on one product, their vaccine, their mRNA vaccine, and that represents half of their net revenues for the year. What does corporate responsibility look like? What does conservation look like when we're talking about how we're going to maintain clean water and steward the land? These are things people want to talk about. And I always tell the young folks, we need to go back to our Constitution, fall in love with it all over again. Because the Constitution, if it doesn't get kicked aside, it really does have the wisdom to solve a lot of these problems. And lastly, we need to talk about taxes. Because quite frankly, we should be talking about getting rid of Social Security taxes completely. We should do that the first month I'm in the office. But we should also talk about personal income taxes being removed. And we should talk about this statewide property tax that Minnesota has that most states don't have. And in Minnesota, I think we're the only state that dumps it into the general fund so the politicians can have at it. This makes no sense at all. Folks, if we're going to continue this conversation about what is Tim Walz going to talk about tonight, I'll tell you what he's not going to talk about. He's not going to talk about the bureaucratic overreach. Here's what let's see. Eric Bum said this. He said he was quite concerned because Tony Fauci has been sounding off. This is Tony Fauci with CNN's Casey Hunt regarding being surprised and disappointed with the federal court ruling that overturned the mask mandate. This is important. So Tony Fauci says this: those types of things really are the purview of the Center for Disease Control. This is a public health issue. We are concerned about that, about courts getting involved in things that are unequivocally public health decisions. I mean, this is a CDC issue. It should not be a court issue. Basically, Fauci seems to believe that the CDC should be outside the constitutional limitations applied to government actions. This is stunning. This is a bureaucratic overreach. We've seen it before, but this is not going to be something that Governor Walz talks about tonight. And he's not going to talk about government overreach and secrecy. I'm coming out with a new book next month. And in that book, I make this comment. I say, if the government can suspend your rights anytime they deem it a crisis, you don't have rights. You have privileges. And I also quote John Kennedy from 1961 when he said this: the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Do you see the abuse here? And then the emergency powers. Oh boy. Here it goes. This is from Cafe Hayek. Governments at all levels have abused their emergency powers during the pandemic. Some deference to public health officials might have been warranted amid the uncertainty early in the pandemic. But as Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote in November of 2020, quote, even if the Constitution has taken a holiday during this pandemic, it cannot become a sabbatical. Jay Bhattacharya, an epidemiologist who I have a tremendous amount of regard for and one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, tweeted this. And I won't do the whole tweet. I'm just going to say this. He says, not all harms from COVIDian policy are reversible, but some are. And he recommended, and I agreed, that we should rehire those who were fired because of vaccine mandates, and they should be receiving back pay. And we should vacate fines for businesses and churches that stayed open. That's what he talks about. And we should prosecute fraud in government COVID spending. There has been an overreach in regards to the policies with this, and we have got to stop it. We're coming to a close. I'm not exactly certain what Tim Walz is going to say about some of the following things, but I want to just talk about this coming election in November. We have the opportunity to make a change. We have a multitude of Republican candidates running, of which I am one. We have numerous Republican candidates that each have an interesting sort of quintessential American story. Take Michelle Benson, a farm girl, married a military man, has served in the Senate and chaired the Health and Human Services Committee, has family, wears lots of hats. It's the quintessential American story. Neil Shah, the child of immigrants, and he's made good. Bright, leading star in med school, started his own clinic. Pretty impressive. Kendall Walz, born in New York and then raised in Oklahoma, and rose to high ranks in the corporate world. I honestly think that I think my story is interesting too and sort of unique. A small town boy who lost both of his parents at early ages due to cancer, had to wind his way into, how am I going to land on a career path? I went from dental school and being president of the dental school class to the seminary to entertaining law school and finally landing in medicine. I had a wonderful career with a larger organization and then decided to start my own clinics. And I've had my daughter come and join me. The quintessential small business American story. So we've got lots of Republican candidates with interesting American stories. And when you look at us on the issues, we have very similar views and perspectives, and I think we all want to see things happen quickly. I think the coming election is a crisis of leadership. You've got Tim Walz leadership on one hand, and I want to talk about that. Not much to say. He freezes, gridlock, 11th hour deals. Do you remember the first lockdown you couldn't get a haircut, but the second one you could? How come? Where was the science, Tim Walz? Are you going to talk about that tonight in your State of the State address? Are you going to tell Minnesotans why for 4 or 5 months you told pharmacies that they couldn't dispense hydroxychloroquine and then you rescinded that part of your order in August of 2020 without really drawing any attention to it? I don't think you're going to. But I think this, the kind of leader I'm going to be for Minnesota is I am going to speak truth to power regardless of how much trouble I get into. I never thought that I would go from Family Doctor of the Year in 2016 to the most investigated physician in Minnesota in 2022. But here I am. But I won't flinch. And I will rebel against stupidity. And when someone tells me that natural immunity doesn't mean anything, doesn't work, I will say hogwash. And when someone tells me that it was a good policy move to pipeline active disease into nursing homes and lock them down, and then to give the person responsible for that job security while 700 healthcare workers were being fired from Mayo Clinic. Honestly, I hope that Commissioner Jan Malcolm sent every one of those 700 healthcare workers a note of appreciation that they stood in the trenches at the beginning of this pandemic and put their lives on the line, and they sacrificed family time. But ultimately they got fired. But Jan Malcolm did not. Those are things that I will do as a leader. We will have these hard conversations, and we will stand for the unborn. We will stand for the unborn, and we're going to trailblaze the issues. And I don't think we're trailblazing the issues. I think what you're going to hear tonight is you're going to hear Tim Walz scold the legislature for not doing their job, even though he was the one who froze for 48 to 72 hours when Jacob Fry didn't quite ask correctly for the National Guard, which Tim Walz called 19-year-old cooks, and which he left when his unit was going to be deployed. He was willing to advance up the ladder of ranks in the National Guard until his unit was going to be deployed, and then all of a sudden it was time to retire. I think we need to have a conversation about that, Tim, but I doubt that you're going to bring it up tonight. I'm sorry, folks, but this is not a time for lollygagging around on something like this. We got to have the hard conversations. I've been attacked on virtually every issue possible. I've been called more names than I've ever been called in my life. So if you think the next 6 months we're going to stand around playing nicey nice with Tim Walz, we're not going to. We're going to have a tough conversation. We've got to. This time around, I'm telling the Republicans and the conservatives, remember, Republicans don't elect Republican governors. We need the independents, and they're coming our way. We need to have conversations with the Hmongs. We need to have conversations with the Latino and the Hispanics and the blacks and the Somalis. We need to have conversations with the Russians. We need to have conversations with every minority group because they want the same things I want: faith, family, freedom. Let's have less government. Let's protect the unborn. Let's be allowed to explore, be exceptional, have my individual liberties, and succeed. I don't need government to give me a handout. Just get out of my way. That's what they want. We need to go to the millennials and the Gen Zs and say, you deserve a seat at the table. We need you. You think differently than we do. We need you at the table. And we need to go to the moms. The Republican Party should shame on itself because, quite frankly, we have not responded to women's concerns strongly enough or promptly enough. Too often our party has been staid and conservative and run by the elites. We need to be the dynamic party of the future that talks about ideas. Conservative comes from the Latin word conservare. It means to safeguard. There's much about America that we want to safeguard. And to those who say we hate America, well, think about moving somewhere else because you don't have any alternative. You never tell me where you want to live. You rip on Sweden. You rip on everything. You hate America. Why don't you step up and get involved and try to build something? I think that's what we need, but I don't think Tim Walz is going to talk about that tonight. So I'm going to dare you. I'm going to dare you. We have a movement started. We have 100,000 people that have joined our email team. We have 500,000 people that follow us on social media every day. We have 20,000 unique donors. I'm asking Minnesotans, conservatives, independents, liberals, join our team. Check us out. We've got to heal Minnesota. We're not one Minnesota. We're about as fractured as you can be. Honestly, Tim Walz has his own CRT. It's, what are your convictions, Tim Walz? And tell us about those. What are you really standing for? And are you relevant? Are you really using your bully pulpit to help elevate the work that the police do, that our first responders do? Because I don't think you are. And I would say this, you've thrown transparency out the window. That's your CRT, convictions, relevance, and transparency. You got to get real, Tim, because Minnesotans are getting darn frustrated. That's why when the recent poll came out, you and I were in almost a dead heat. We're going to have some conversations. We're going to have some interesting debates coming up. Riots, lockdowns, haircuts, autonomous zones. Are you going to talk about those things tonight, Governor Walz? I doubt it. Folks, if he does talk about Walz checks, those aren't Walz checks. It's about theft. There is no $10 billion surplus. There's a $10 billion theft. You and me as Minnesota residents, we have the obligation to fund the budget that's passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. We've done that, and they took $10 billion more than they needed. That's theft, and it goes back to Minnesotans, the Minnesotans that paid it. I went on longer than I intended, but I suspect that Governor Walz is going to go on at least as long as I have. Minnesota, we are on an unsustainable path. I did this address early so that Governor Walz can revise his comments. Speak to the issues that really get at the hearts and minds and souls of Minnesotans, Governor Walz. This is the time, and I dare Minnesota. Embrace our campaign. You want to know why Matt Burke joined me? Because I wanted a man who was determined, who had a character of a Christian, God-fearing man, and I wanted someone who had a skill set that intersects with mine because he's got skills I don't have. We will elevate faith for all faiths. We will elevate the Founding Fathers' wisdom. We will absolutely defend freedom at every level, and families will be secure, and the unborn will be protected. Tim Walz, you're on in 1 hour. Good luck. I hope you're relevant, and I look forward to the conversations to come. Thank you, and thank you, Minnesota, for listening.